if you haven't already done it, ask yourself, what are my core beliefs and my core values that I want to represent as a leader? And when I show up in a situation, am I going to be able to live by those values and demonstrate those to the people around me?
Welcome to the People Powered Solutions podcast. In this show, you'll gain expert advice and tips on building a thriving workplace culture with happy employees. I'm your host, Lorianne Duguay, and I'm thrilled to be spending this time with you today. Hello, and welcome to People Powered Solutions podcast. Today, we welcome Doug Thorpe, leadership coach and expert. Throughout his career, Doug has been a student of effective and inspiring leadership. Numerous senior leadership roles and many different client opportunities have allowed him to gain valuable experiences, which he now shares with you. First, as commissioned Army officer, then as a senior officer of a large and very well-managed regional bank, he gained frontline leadership experience. Later, he left for the private sector, where he led 3 entrepreneurial startups and a regional nonprofit. With this wide range of practical experience, he helps leaders get clarity with their own ideas to grow businesses and lead people. Welcome, Doug.
Hi, Lori. Pleasure to be here.
Awesome to have you. I actually initially met Doug as a guest on his show, and right away we discovered synergies between the work we do. So, Doug, why don't you share with the audience how you ended up doing what you're now doing on a full-time basis?
Yeah, Lori, thanks. Well, as it was kind of inferred in the intro there, I have been a student of leadership my whole career. I've had some great opportunities to be in roles of leadership. But as much as that was great, there was even the opportunity. I worked with some great leaders, and I just got curious about the whole subject of leadership. And I did have my experience of occasionally working for people that weren't so good at it. And it put me on a journey. And I think the pivot point for me was in one chapter of my career, I did turn to consulting. And I found that the clients with whom I was engaging had these moments where they would call me in their office, shut the door, I want to talk. And they would just start sort of bearing their soul about challenges and problems they were having. And I don't know what that meant about how I show up, but I guess I'm a trusting face or something.
Clearly, you're a trusted advisor.
I was brought into confidence, and we would talk, and I discovered that maybe there's something to the whole possibility of being a coach. For me, what's morphed into the real focus. My mantra is leadership powered by common sense. That's the name of my podcast and video show. And the thing about that is that we need leaders in the world, and we need them in all aspects of life. We need them at work, we need them at home, and we need them in the community. And whether or not you sit in a position that gives you a title of leadership, you can still be a leader. You can be someone who inspires and influences people to serve a greater good. And that's my passion and focus.
I love that story. One of the pieces of your story that really resonates is this notion of how you initially came in consulting, and they start to kind of vent, if you will, or really kind of open up in terms of some of their challenges and struggles. In all my work with leaders, I've heard a lot that leadership is an extremely lonely place to be. You know, what's the saying? It's lonely at the top, but I think people kind of think like it's almost a sarcastic way of saying, oh, stop complaining, you've got it good. But ultimately it truly is, because you're that conduit between your senior leaders and your team, and you're not really sure, what you can vet through your peers without looking incompetent. You absolutely don't want to, bring your challenges to your senior leader team, so then they'll doubt your abilities, and obviously not going to go to your direct reports. So really interesting that you discovered a bit of a niche relevant to being able to support leaders through some of these ongoing challenges. Super interesting how it kind of unfolded. You spoke about, I love the name of your podcast, by the way, Leadership by Common Sense. Is that what it is? Sorry.
Powered by common sense.
Powered by common sense. Yes. One of the things I've realized over, I would say, the past 3 to 5 years is that common sense isn't quite as common
That's
as
right.
we think, right? So
Right.
talk to us a bit about how you work with leaders. What are some of those kind of popular challenges that leaders come to you looking for answers on?
Well, first, let me say the reason I landed on that theme, leadership powered by common sense, is that one very big observation I had in engaging with leaders of all kinds and in all different industries. The business world is very fast. We have morphed into a phase of high velocity, a lot of ambiguity, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of velocity, and a lot of complexity.
Mm,
And people have somehow migrated into the thinking as they have advanced in their career path. Well, I'm only going to advance if I get more complex.
mm,
Well, the problem with that is there's an old adage that comes out of the sales world, and it says a confused mind says no.
mm.
And I think that applies to leaders. If you cannot create perfect clarity for your team, they don't know what to do next. They and they're generally going to be motivated to do nothing because they don't want to do the wrong thing.
Exactly, exactly. And that's clarity is one of the top, employee needs in the workplace. They need to understand what the expectations are. They need to be provided with a line of sight. What are they working towards, right? So do you feel that leaders naturally provide that, or is this something that you need to work with them on understanding? Like when you do come in and you talk about clarity, do you feel that they're somewhat resistant to it, or how do you feel that they react to that?
Well, I think they're caught in the hamster wheel of the velocity and the complexity of business, and they're solving problems that involve a lot of really substantial moving parts most of the time. And when you try to talk about, I'll call it personnel and initiatives, and that may mean leading a project or guiding a task. The the temptation is to prove your worth by your technical knowledge, and so you're talking in the jargon and in the deep dive terminology, and you're kind of trying to dazzle everybody with how much you know, and they're sitting there going, boss, just tell me the next thing. I mean,
Oh
what do you
yeah,
want me
that's
to
all
do
they
next?
want.
What do
Yeah.
you want me
What
to
do you
do
need from
next?
me? Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's true that we seem to see a lot of leaders who think that to ascend into that leadership role, they need to add that level of complexity, like you say. They need to add those big words. They need to add that depth of knowledge. But I've also seen some highly, highly technical leaders be absolutely horrible in people management,
Oh,
right? They
for
were
sure.
promoted in too many organizations. I find it, I don't know if this is something you've noticed, where organizations promote based on either seniority or on expertise relevant to some technical piece. They don't promote necessarily on a, merit in terms of how they manage people.
Right. Well, I talk about this frequently, and I've mentioned it many times on my show. I write it in my blog, and I definitely work with it for my clients. And that is that we have this strange tradition in modern business that when we need a frontline supervisor, we go look at the team and we pick the best producer. And
Mm.
whether that's because of technical knowledge or production or performance, to your point, we anoint them as a supervisor manager, and then if they successfully muddle through that assignment, what do? We recognize them with another promotion. We bump them up a level, and now they are unit manager. And then if they muddle through that, we let them be a managing director, and then pretty soon they're a VP. And you've never focused on potential and ability to lead and inspire people. And sadly, although there are many companies that are getting much more enlightened in this area, but they wait until about that fourth or fifth promotion to say, maybe we should send this person to a leadership class. Maybe we should give them some leadership training. And that usually gets me into the core discussion of asking people, do they understand or they believe there's a difference between management and leadership?
Oh, I like it.
And of course there is. And I used to just ask that question, is there a difference? And for a time, people would struggle with that. But now what I've found the pattern is, yes, I believe there's one. And then you follow up with the question, well, what is it? And that's where people get stumped.
Well, let's taste your medicine then. What do you believe? How do you define the difference between leadership and management?
I borrow a simple phrase that a good friend of mine taught me many years ago. He had done some exhaustive study of high performing CEOs. And the phrase he came up with is management is about process and leadership is about people.
Oh, I like it.
And when I unpack that and think about it, what my truth is, I have found there are definitely people who have made whole careers out of being, quote, good managers.
Mm,
And by that I mean, they hit the numbers, they performed on the plan, they executed. But when you usually study those situations, there's a whole lot of collateral damage. There's not a lot of high morale on the team. There's turnover. There's constant retraining, realignment, a lot of things. So the people side of that activity usually isn't a pretty picture.
mm,
But when you find a leader, yes, they learn how to manage the process, but they are also heavily focused and committed to the development of the people on their team
mhm.
and serving employee needs, employee expectations, and not afraid to say no. I'm not saying they're just pancakes rolling over every day, but they are, making good calls. They're fair, they're equitable, they're honest, they're transparent, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
I love it. I love that you're kind of building a profile for the listeners of what are some of those attributes they should be seeking in their future leaders, right? I was coaching a leader this morning, and she was saying she was interviewing for a senior leadership position. She's in HR, so she wanted to hire a manager in another office, and an HR manager, and she says, I really struggle with this. And I said, why do you think that is? She's like, well, I find that if I've done a lot of reflecting, I realize that in the past, I've been hiring managers for their personalities, for how they jive with the rest of my team. And, I figure that the technical stuff we can teach, but what that's actually led her to is a serial hiring of bad, incompetent managers. So she's like, where's that sweet spot between the two? Right? How do you make sure that they do have that personality that will mesh well with the remainder of the team, all the while still having a level of competency that will enable them to deliver on their function? I'm like, well, I'd like to talk about the interview. What kind of questions are you asking in the interview? And she's like, well, they're primarily situational. I was like, okay. The risk of those kinds of situational only questions is that you have some pro interviewees, as well as you've got interviewees who might be highly competent, but they choke in an interview. So I said, I would challenge you to integrate an assignment of sorts, where you give them a series of 5 different emails that showed up in their inbox that morning, and you ask them to talk about, you give them 25 minutes, whatever, a half hour, look at these, review them, and now tell me which task you're going to tackle in which order, and briefly how you plan on tackling that task. You really get a realistic preview of how they would approach it, what's their critical thinking, and you get to see them in the act of managing on the spot, right? The other one I told her about is putting together an operational plan. Right there, you can determine who's a leader, who's a manager. So you've been asked to put together your departmental operational plan. Give them 15 minutes to think about this and walk us through how you'd approach that. So if they're doing, well, I would contact this and look at these numbers and then put it together based on the history. Beautiful, yes. However, what's missing in that? are you going to communicate with the team? Are you going to bring their ideas to the table? How are you going to engage with them, right? So that just their approach to that kind of an assignment during the interview and the selection process can start to give you an inclination as to what kind of a leader, whether they're a leader, I guess, and to use your example, whether they're a leader or a manager,
Right.
right?
Well, part of what I heard in what you were describing there, if I can unpack it for a minute, is there is always the inevitable risk that once you're in a position of authority, you might tend to hire people like you.
Oh yeah, that's a good.
And that is an ever-present risk that leaders need to worry about and think about. And to your point, find ways to test the candidate for a different kind of fit, maybe. Very informed leaders frequently will intentionally choose someone that's a polar opposite so they can get some balance in thinking and some perhaps challenging and collaborative thoughts present. And the higher up the emotional intelligence scale a leader goes, they are more likely to do that rather than simply ask the questions that reaffirm their own biases and beliefs and add to a team that is going to do nothing but that. So, in my mind, and you got a great scenario there. There's so many things that impact culture and performance of the organization based on that hiring process. So the other thought I had as you were describing that is one of the things I might have said to that leader as well is, well, let's talk about the kind of culture you're trying to build. Is it just about performance and execution, or is there a set of values that you want to reinforce and provide, and your culture helps drive your brand and all of those things? It becomes a very complex challenge.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why so many managers just aren't good at the hiring process and don't need to be involved in it.
I agree. I agree. So I'm hearing this is kind of naturally becoming a bit of a best practices for, that hiring that next leader within your organization. So far we've covered, have a profile of what are the attributes, and you spoke of those ideal attributes of a leader that really differentiate a leader from a manager. So have that profile in mind as you're structuring and designing your interview process, your selection process, but also just the attraction piece, right? Where you're looking for these people, who are you trying to attract? So to be clear on that, and that kind of speaks to your just last point about, what kind of culture you're trying to build and make sure that you're getting the leadership to be able to fuel that culture. But the second piece that you mentioned, relevant to ensuring that you're not hiring someone who's exactly like you, and recognizing the value of diversity and the value of hiring, different personality styles within that team to make sure that there's a beautiful balance and that you've got the broader scope of opinion and of ideas at the table. Awesome. What other different, best practices would you share with leaders relevant to hiring that next leader?
A really hot topic that is out there today is this whole notion of accountability. And accountability has become a very negative word in most situations as I've seen them. There's an intellectual aspect of it saying, of course, we want our people to be accountable for the ultimate performance of the company. But when you try to start doing that one-on-one with a manager slash leader, having to talk with a member of their team, the question becomes, well, how do you even set up accountability? And so people have migrated a little bit to the idea of, well, let's have a talk about expectations. So that word is now starting to kind of get used and abused in the spirit of it. But there's even one more layer that I think is missing in most employee-employer conversations, and that's obligation. And it's kind of in real simple terms, I'll go back to my banking roots, contract law. You've got two parties coming together, and what is the essence of a contract? Both parties have expectations, but to get there, you both need to stipulate obligations. All right, here's what I'm going to bring to the table, and for that I get X. And so it's this expectation obligation balance that's so critical. And the first time I was challenged to think in these terms, I said to myself, even for my 30 years in management, I never talked to anybody about the obligation part. It was
Mm,
all implied and inferred. Yes, I'm going to pay you. Yes, I'm going to promote you periodically. Yes, you'll get a bonus. You'll get a review every year, blah, blah, blah. Well, that's just such a weak part of the equation.
mm,
And the actual way that this is set up, and for those who want to hear a whole lot more, I've got an episode on my podcast. The title of it is Two in the Canoe.
I love it.
And it's the idea of the employer employee coming together and having that honest discussion. So it kind of generally starts with the boss saying, all right, Lori, if you're my employee, tell me about your expectations. You agreed to come on here. What do you really want to know? What do you see your career doing? How do you think? Well, that's usually a discussion that's maybe a courtesy or something, and maybe there's some genuine meaning to it. But employees are usually pretty quick and able to describe that. But then if I were your boss and I turned around and said, all right, that's all fair. What's your sense of obligation to get there?
Mm,
What?
mm,
What does
mm,
that mean?
mm,
And but you have that part of the discussion, then you turn it around and you say, all right, now let me share with you. Here's my sense of expectation, and I will share my obligations. So as the employer, I'm going to say things like, well, my expectation is we need you to come to work on time. We need you to follow our procedures. We need you to take the training. We need you to, use the machines properly, blah, 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 follow safety rules, all of those things. But my obligation is I'm going to provide you the training. I'm going to provide you the tools. I'm going to provide you the equipment. I will give you advancement opportunity. I will give you your benefits package and, so on and so on and so on. So the point in all that is if you level set correctly on the early end, the front end of the relationship,
mm.
then it's much easier to have that accountability talk.
Absolutely.
No, hey,
Absolutely.
Lori, remember back in January when we talked
Yeah.
about X, Y, and Z? I'm not seeing that.
Yeah, I agree. I
And that could
agree.
have consequences on your sense of entitlement for reward and recognition and all that. And I want to give you a heads up. You got a lot of opportunity here to turn
Yeah.
it around.
Yeah, absolutely. Have you ever heard of Vince Molinaro?
No, I don't think so.
So he wrote a book, actually it's a trilogy called The Leadership Contract. And so it's pretty much what you're talking about. And Accountable Leaders is his program that's kind of derived from there. And it's literally about leaders making a commitment. So to your later point, I love the explanation between the employee and the leader, but the leadership contract is about obligations and making leaders and holding leaders accountable to what they're committing to as a leader within this organization. And he literally has them sign leadership contracts with each of
Mhm.
the leader as at the onset of their program with him, as they're working through the training and understanding and really developing that mindset, that accountability mindset, and helping them understand it. Because until leaders understand it themselves and understand what it is specifically they've signed up for as a leader and what are their obligations to that point relevant to their teams and to the company, we can't even expect to start to convey it to employees.
Right,
That first
right,
step
right.
is really, so if you haven't read it, I certainly recommend it. Super great read. He's Canadian as well, which is just, I like to support Canadian authors.
It's
So
just a
yeah,
bonus. It's just a
yeah, it's
bonus.
just a bonus. Yeah. Awesome. So I'm hearing, I like that whole story about helping your teams. Before you get to the accountability piece, you really need to be clear. Again, comes back to that clarity of expectations on both sides, right? And then you can have that accountability. Once
Yeah.
they've committed and they understand what they're committing to, what those obligations are, then you can have the accountability talk. Love it. What other best practices when it comes to great leaders are you wanting to share with the audience?
Well, there is also an emerging focus and learning that's happening around the whole idea. The new phrase I've heard is human-centric leadership.
Mhm.
And that implies and infers the idea of when my people show up in the morning and clock in, it's not necessarily just about the work. You know,
Mm,
they're going to bring their whole self to work, which
mm,
can be good and bad, right? And I started coaching executives with the idea that we need to introduce a respect for Maslow's hierarchy of need,
mhm.
and the whole idea that we as human beings, we live our lives day by day somewhat bouncing up and down Maslow's hierarchy. And if you're not familiar with that,
I
I won't
am.
go into all the detail, but it on the one extreme at the base, it starts with the simple element of survival. Am I
Mhm.
even going to make it through the day? Am I going to have shelter and food and protection, for the day? And then you go on up to things like being wanting to be part of a community, be part of a tribe, and be engaged with others. And then at the peak, of course, is this notion of self-actualization. Everything's optimized, everything's totally fulfilled. The challenge as a leader, as I see it, is you may be rocking along, and I'll use the example. You've got this rock star performer on your team, and you just basically have to whisper something at them and they take off running and they produce this amazing output. But they're doing this day over day over day, and all of a sudden they show up one day and they're just flat. I mean, their affect is bad, their attitude is bad, and you're going, what in the world happened? Well, likely there was some catastrophic event in their life, you know, someone got sick, someone died, something happened, their spouse presented them with divorce papers, who knows what, but their whole cart gets caught, dumped in
Castle.
the
Yeah.
ditch,
Yeah.
and they are not going to be able to perform. And the brain scientists tell us if we fall back down on that base level of the Maslow's hierarchy, we get into this proverbial fight or flight mindset. And the brain chemistry shifts when that happens. All the blood leaves your frontal lobes, and that's where your intellect and critical thinking happens. And it all goes elsewhere to protect you and secure you. So you're not going to be able to perform because work is done in the frontal lobes of the brain, the critical thinking, the intellectual capacity.
Exactly.
So there's a legitimate reason where your star performer is not able to perform anymore.
Absolutely.
So for human-centric leaders, you begin to open the lens and think about those things and show some empathy, show some appreciation. Walk up to that person and say, "Gee, George, you don't look good today. Are you okay? Is there anything going on?" And if they do share, you know, try to have the grace and spirit to say, well, why don't you take the day off? Go
Mm,
fix that. Go handle
mm.
that. You don't need to be here. We'll be okay. We'll figure it out.
I love it. I love it. Um, and I like that you spoke of needs, because that's, for our listeners are aware, that's what my book's going to be about, right? It's 10, there's 10 reasons that an employee will thrive at work. There's 10 elements that once they're infused into their day-to-day, they'll thrive. But on that same note, if some of these crucial basic needs at work are missing, you're going to start to see some symptoms, if you will, such as poor performance, otherwise checked out, high absenteeism. And when you start to see and you reframe those behavioral issues as a symptom of something a bit deeper happening, to your example, maybe something happened, at home. Maybe it's because they don't see that the growth opportunities, and they're starting to check out, starting to shop. That fight or flight mode is kicking in, and their inclination is to flee and to go and find work that will meet their needs elsewhere, right? So I like that you use that example, and it's a very valid example of Maslow's, just what are those 5 human needs, that pyramid of needs, absolutely. But to that point, within the way you structure their day-to-day, the way you structure their workplace will also impact, how engaged they are, how motivated they are to deliver. So that high performer you talked about earlier, maybe it is because, from a work-life balance perspective, something's happened in their home life that has thrown their work life off balance.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe high performers by nature crave the challenge. They crave a different, that next level of action and results. How are you providing for that craving, right? How are you giving them the developmental opportunities? Or are you inviting them to sit at the table with some senior executives to start to give them a taste of what they can expect if they continue to perform at that level, right?
Right.
So I guess all that to say, when you do see some of these behavioral issues, when you do see these absolute, shifts in people's personalities at work, reframe that as what might be underlying this behavior, what is missing in their day-to-day, and have that conversation and train your leaders to have those conversations. Because too often than not, I think their fear, or just maybe just not understanding how to ask those kinds of questions to really unearth what the root cause is, will have them just avoiding the conversation altogether, which, as you mentioned, can.
And that possibly merges and marries up real nicely with what we were talking about earlier on the expectation obligation thing. And I'm thinking about a very extreme example, but I was coaching with some people about a year ago, and the junior executive had a special needs child at home. And he and his wife, wife also worked, so they worked out a bit of their own private 911 system. They actually commissioned separate phones just for events that might be related to the child. Mm-hmm. But in his mind, as far as expectation at work, he wanted to be able to bring that phone to meetings because he might get a call and it would be critical, something. And the rule of the road was this isn't just casual chit chat about the child, but emergency developments like a seizure or a collapse or something like that. And the work environment didn't want phones at certain meetings, period. So there was a conflict there and a requirement that was out of balance, an expectation that didn't meet on either side. So, it actually, well, there were a couple of other particular instances, and sadly, at the end of the whole story is there was an agreement that it wasn't a fit. And I thought, well, I did not fault the employer for allowing that to stay on the list of a couple of matters that caused the separation, but I thought, come on, guys, you can waive that rule in this one case.
Exception, like don't be so rigid.
That part, the employer ought to budge on a little bit. That seems like a fully reasonable request.
God, absolutely. Wow. I'm sorry, I'm baffled that they would maybe lose a high performer because their inability to read through the lines and to see that this is really an exceptional case and there is some wiggle room. So Doug, I think we could continue talking for a very, very long time because we have so much in common. But in the spirit of wrapping up here, I would love for you to tell us provide our audience with one kind of tip. One of those key strategies or tips or tricks that they need to be aware of from a leadership perspective.
I think there are many I can think of, but I guess the one that's top of mind today that I'll share with you, I encourage leaders to try to spend a minute focusing on their own sense of a leadership framework, and ask yourself the question, what do I believe in? What kind of leader do I want to be? And going back to our notion of attributes of leadership, there are thousands of books written about leadership, and they all have a list of attributes. The vocabulary is very common, and there are many, many things to think about. But If you haven't already done it, ask yourself, what are my core beliefs and my core values that I want to represent as a leader? And when I show up in a situation, am I going to be able to live by those values and demonstrate those to the people around me?
So important, so important. And in working with leaders and going through that exercise of mind setting, but also creating your own leadership blueprint, if you will, of where's that, what kind of a leader do you want to be? I think I'd also add to then reference the company or organizational values, vision, and mission. And does your blueprint align with that overarching blueprint, right? And then if there is misalignment, there's maybe a decision of, do I need to grow or do I need to go to a company whose mission, vision, and values align better with my leadership?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yep.
Thank you, Doug. That's amazing. If folks want to continue the conversation, where can they connect with you and what can they check out?
I've made it real easy to do that. My website is my name, Doug Thorpe, and that's THORPE.com. DougThorpe.com's got links to a lot of programs, a lot of materials, my 5 books, and my podcast. So, a lot of content there. And by the way, I do offer, there is a button there to schedule a free discovery call. I'm happy to talk with individuals who are interested in pursuing this discussion, or they've got questions that are very specific in nature. Happy to offer up that free consultation. We can have a chat. Whether we agree to work something out after the fact is yet to be determined, but hop over there, check it out.
Love it. Well, thank you. It sounds like there's many ways they can continue the conversation and continue finding more about Doug Thorpe out. We will share all of these links in the show notes. So folks, you're welcome to navigate there to find all of the different resources. Thank you, Doug, for once again, an amazing conversation.
My pleasure. Thank you, Lori.
Well, folks, thanks for joining us for yet another enriching conversation. To hear more about today's guests, make sure to check out the links in the description of this episode. Want to continue the conversation? Then head on over to our social media platforms, all of which are also linked in the description, to keep it going. Finally, don't forget to subscribe to make sure you don't miss another valuable episode.